What happens when one of television's most seasoned political journalists goes head-to-head with royalty's most controversial figure? You won't believe what unfolds when George Stephanopoulos sits across from Meghan Markle in what was supposed to be a standard promotional appearance that quickly spiraled into one of the most explosive confrontations in recent television history. The Duchess of Sussex walked into that studio expecting softball questions about her latest humanitarian projects, but she was about to face the kind of journalistic scrutiny that has made careers crumble and reputations shatter. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when these two powerhouses clash in a battle of wits that nobody saw coming. The tension was palpable from the moment Meghan Markle settled into the guest chair opposite George Stephanopoulos on his primetime special. What viewers initially witnessed appeared to be the standard pre-interview pleasantries: a warm smile from the host, the guest adjusting her microphone, the usual small talk about the weather and travel. But seasoned Stephanopoulos watchers could sense something different in his demeanor. His trademark intensity was dialed up several notches, his questions more pointed than usual, his follow-ups more aggressive. The veteran journalist had clearly done his homework, and it became apparent within minutes that this wasn't going to be the friendly chat Meghan's team had negotiated. "Thank you for joining us tonight, Duchess," Stephanopoulos began, his voice carrying that familiar authoritative tone that has made world leaders squirm in their seats. "I want to start with your recent comments about media accountability and the responsibility of journalists to tell the truth. Given your own complicated relationship with accuracy in public statements, don't you think there's a certain irony in positioning yourself as a champion of media integrity?" The question hit like a sledgehammer. Meghan's media-trained smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, barely perceptible to casual viewers, but Stephanopoulos caught it. Her handlers in the control room likely felt their stomachs drop as they realized this wasn't going to be the promotional puff piece they'd anticipated. This was George Stephanopoulos in full investigative mode, treating the Duchess not like royalty, but like any other public figure who needed to be held accountable for their statements. "I'm not sure I understand the premise of your question, George," Meghan responded, her voice maintaining its practiced calm but with an edge that hadn't been there moments before. "I've always been committed to truth and transparency in everything I do. My advocacy for media responsibility comes from a place of personal experience with how devastating false narratives can be." But Stephanopoulos wasn't satisfied with the diplomatic non-answer. He leaned forward slightly, a gesture that regular viewers of his show recognize as the moment he's about to go for the jugular. "Personal experience, yes. Let's talk about that. You've made several public statements over the years that have later been contradicted by documented evidence. The Archbishop of Canterbury himself had to correct your claim about a private wedding ceremony. Your own father has disputed key elements of your narrative about your childhood. How do you reconcile advocating for media truth-telling when your own relationship with facts has been questioned?" The studio fell silent, except for the barely audible hum of the cameras. This was not the softball territory Meghan was accustomed to navigating in her carefully curated media appearances. Her team had likely prepared her for questions about her charitable work, her children, maybe even some gentle probing about royal family dynamics. They hadn't prepared her for this level of journalistic scrutiny, the kind that Stephanopoulos has perfected over decades of interviewing politicians who think they can spin their way out of any controversy. Meghan's posture shifted almost imperceptibly. The relaxed, confident bearing she'd entered with began to tighten. "George, I think you're conflating different situations and taking them out of context. The Archbishop's comments were about a technical, legal ceremony versus a personal, spiritual commitment. These are nuanced situations that don't lend themselves to black and white characterizations." The deflection was smooth, professional, exactly what her media training had taught her. But Stephanopoulos had been doing this long enough to recognize a pivot when he heard one. More importantly, he had the research to back up his line of questioning, and he wasn't about to let her redirect the conversation to safer ground. "Nuanced, certainly," he replied, his tone remaining conversational but his eyes sharp. "But we're not talking about interpretation here. We're talking about factual accuracy. You stated categorically that you were married 3 days before the public ceremony. The Archbishop confirmed that no such ceremony took place. That's not nuance. That's a contradiction of documented fact. And it's part of a pattern that makes your current media advocacy seem somewhat hypocritical. The word hypocritical hung in the air like a challenge thrown down. For someone who has spent the better part of her adult life carefully crafting her public image, being directly accused of hypocrisy on national television was clearly not something Meghan had anticipated. Her media handlers had probably run through dozens of potential difficult questions, but direct confrontation about her credibility wasn't something they'd adequately prepared for. "I find it interesting," Meghan said, her voice now carrying a slight chill, "that you're choosing to focus on technical details rather than the substance of important issues. This feels very much like the kind of gotcha journalism that I've been speaking out against." It was a calculated move, attempting to turn the tables and make Stephanopoulos the problem rather than addressing the substance of his questions. But if she thought she could rattle a journalist who has interviewed presidents and prime ministers, she had badly miscalculated. Stephanopoulos didn't take the bait. "This isn't gotcha journalism, Duchess. This is basic fact-checking. When public figures make statements that can be verified or contradicted by public records, journalists have an obligation to point out those contradictions. That's not gotcha, that's accountability. Something you claim to support." The tension in the studio was becoming impossible to ignore. Camera operators were getting shots they hadn't expected. Producers were probably scrambling to figure out how much of this would actually make it to air. And Meghan was clearly realizing that this interview was spiraling far from her comfort zone. But this was only the beginning. Stephanopoulos had more ammunition, and he was just getting warmed up. What happened next would push this confrontation from uncomfortable to explosive, as the veteran journalist prepared to challenge the Duchess on the very foundation of her public narrative. Stephanopoulos reached for a folder on his desk, a move that anyone familiar with his interview style knows means he's about to present documentation that will make his guest very uncomfortable. The folder contained what would become the smoking gun of this confrontation, research that his team had meticulously compiled over weeks of preparation. When he opened it, Meghan's eyes darted to the papers with visible concern. "Let's talk about your advocacy work," Stephanopoulos continued, his voice taking on the prosecutorial tone that has made him one of television's most feared interviewers. "You've positioned yourself as a champion of women's rights and equality, particularly focusing on your work before joining the royal family. But I have some documents here that paint a very different picture of your actual involvement versus your public claims." The shift in Meghan's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. Gone was the polished composure she'd maintained through the earlier exchanges. Her shoulders tensed, her hands gripped the arms of her chair more tightly, and for the first time since the interview began, she looked genuinely rattled. This wasn't territory she could deflect with practiced sound bites about nuance and context. "I'm not sure what you're referring to, George, but I've been very transparent about my humanitarian work and my passion for gender equality," she said. But her voice had lost its earlier confidence. There was a defensive edge creeping in that suggested she knew exactly where this was heading. Stephanopoulos pulled out the first document, holding it so the cameras could capture it while keeping the details visible to Meghan. "This is from the organization you claim to have worked closely with on water access projects in Rwanda. According to their executive director, your actual involvement consisted of a single photo opportunity during a brief visit. No ongoing work, no meaningful contribution to their programs, no follow-up engagement. Yet in multiple interviews, you've described this as foundational to your advocacy." The accusation hit like a physical blow. Meghan's carefully constructed narrative about her pre-royal humanitarian work was being systematically dismantled on live television, and she clearly hadn't expected this level of investigative scrutiny. Her media training had prepared her for difficult questions, but not for a journalist who had actually done the legwork to verify her claims. That's an oversimplification of complex relationships and work that often happens behind the scenes, Meghan responded, but her deflection sounded weak even to her own ears. Not every contribution can be measured in traditional metrics. Behind-the-scenes work, Stephanopoulos repeated, his tone making it clear he wasn't buying the explanation. Let's examine that claim. He pulled out another document. This is from the women's shelter in Los Angeles, where you claimed to volunteer regularly during your acting career. They have no record of any volunteer work by you. The only interaction they can document is a single promotional visit that was photographed for a magazine spread. The studio atmosphere was becoming electric. This wasn't just tough questioning anymore. This was a systematic deconstruction of Meghan's entire public persona. Camera operators were capturing every micro-expression, every telling pause, every moment of visible discomfort as the Duchess realized that her carefully crafted image was being exposed as largely fictional. George, I think you're being deliberately misleading about the nature of humanitarian work and how these organizations operate, Meghan said, her voice rising slightly in pitch, a telltale sign of stress that media experts would analyze for days afterward. Many contributions and relationships aren't documented in the way you're suggesting they should be. But Stephanopoulos was relentless. Years of interviewing politicians had taught him to recognize when someone was evading rather than answering, and he pressed his advantage. Aren't documented or didn't happen. Because what I'm seeing here is a pattern of you claiming substantive involvement in causes where the evidence suggests your participation was purely performative. Photo ops, not actual work. The word performative clearly stung. Meghan's face flushed slightly, and for the first time in the interview, her polished media persona began to crack. I find it incredibly offensive that you would characterize my genuine commitment to these causes as performative. I've dedicated years of my life to advocacy work. Have you, though? Stephanopoulos shot back, his journalistic instincts in full gear. Because the documentation I have suggests otherwise. It suggests a pattern of brief, highly publicized interactions that were then inflated into claims of deep, ongoing involvement. That's not dedication. That's image management. The confrontation had reached a critical turning point. What had started as uncomfortable questioning had evolved into a full-scale challenge to Meghan's credibility and authenticity. The Duchess was no longer just defending specific claims, she was fighting for the very foundation of her public identity. You're twisting facts to create a narrative, Meghan said, her voice now carrying unmistakable anger. This is exactly the kind of hostile, biased reporting that I've been speaking out against. You've clearly come into this interview with an agenda. Stephanopoulos leaned back slightly, a gesture that conveyed both confidence and slight amusement at the accusation. My agenda is truth, Duchess. When public figures make claims about their background and experience, especially when they're using those claims to advocate for causes or criticize others, those claims should be verifiable. What I'm presenting isn't bias, it's documentation. The exchange was becoming increasingly heated, with both participants dropping any pretense of cordial discussion. Meghan was clearly feeling cornered, while Stephanopoulos was doing what he does best, holding a public figure accountable for their statements regardless of their status or title. Documentation that's been selectively chosen and taken out of context, Meghan fired back, her composure continuing to erode. I've never claimed to be a traditional aid worker or to have spent years in refugee camps, but I have used my platform to highlight important causes, and that work has real value. Using your platform and claiming hands-on involvement are two very different things, Stephanopoulos replied. And the distinction matters when you're criticizing others for their approach to these same issues. You can't claim moral authority based on experience you don't actually have. The studio was crackling with tension as both participants dug in for what was clearly becoming an all-out confrontation. But what came next would push this already explosive situation to its absolute breaking point, as Stephanopoulos prepared to reveal the most damaging information of all. Stephanopoulos reached deeper into his folder and pulled out what appeared to be financial documents, his expression grave. The cameras caught Meghan's eyes widening as she recognized what he was holding. Clearly, this was information she had hoped would never see the light of day. Let's talk about the financial side of your advocacy work, Stephanopoulos said, his voice carrying the weight of a prosecutor presenting key evidence. You've repeatedly criticized other celebrities and public figures for profiting from charitable causes. You've positioned yourself as someone who puts service above personal gain. But these financial records tell a very different story. Meghan's face went pale. Whatever was in those documents, it was clear she knew exactly what Stephanopoulos was about to reveal. Her handlers in the control room were probably scrambling, but there was no way to stop what was coming. I don't know what you think you have there, but any suggestion that I've profited inappropriately from charitable work is completely false, Meghan said. But her voice was shaking now. The confident, media-trained Duchess, who had walked into the studio, was completely gone, replaced by someone who looked genuinely panicked. Is it false? Stephanopoulos pressed, holding up the first document. Because this shows a consulting fee of $250,000 paid to your personal company from a charity you were supposedly volunteering for. That's quite a generous payment for volunteer work, wouldn't you say? The revelation hit like a bombshell. Meghan's mouth opened slightly, then closed, as if she was struggling to find words. This wasn't just about inflated claims or photo opportunities anymore. This was about actual financial impropriety, the kind of scandal that could destroy someone's credibility permanently. That payment was for legitimate consulting services, she finally managed, but her voice was barely above a whisper. It's completely above board and properly documented. Consulting services that were never disclosed publicly. Stephanopoulos shot back. While you were giving interviews about the purity of your motives and criticizing others for mixing charity with personal gain, you were quietly collecting six-figure payments from the very organizations you claimed to be serving out of pure altruism. The hypocrisy was staggering, and Stephanopoulos wasn't finished. He pulled out another document, his expression becoming even more serious. And this is just the beginning. I have records showing similar payments from 3 other organizations, totaling over $500,000 in fees that were never publicly disclosed. Fees collected while you were building a public brand as someone who serves others without thought of personal benefit. Meghan was visibly struggling now, her carefully maintained composure completely shattered. She looked like someone who had been caught in a lie so massive that there was no way to spin or deflect her way out of it. Those were legitimate business arrangements, she said, but even she seemed to realize how weak the defense sounded. Business arrangements, Stephanopoulos repeated, his tone making it clear what he thought of that characterization. So when you were giving tearful interviews about your passion for service, when you were criticizing others for commercializing charity work, you were actually running a profitable consulting business with these same organizations? And you never thought to mention this rather significant conflict of interest? The question hung in the air like an indictment. Meghan looked around the studio as if searching for an escape route, her media training completely failing her in the face of such damning evidence. I think this interview has become incredibly hostile and unfair, she said, her voice breaking slightly. You're taking legitimate business practices and trying to make them sound sinister. I'm not making anything sound like anything, Stephanopoulos replied, his journalistic instincts fully engaged. I'm simply presenting documented facts about payments you received while publicly claiming to work for free. The audience can decide what that sounds like. Meghan stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor in a way that made everyone in the studio jump. The sudden movement caught the camera operators off guard, and they scrambled to adjust their shots as she began removing her microphone with shaking hands. This is exactly the kind of ambush journalism that destroys people's lives, she said, her voice now openly angry and emotional. You brought me here under false pretenses to attack my character and my work with information taken completely out of context. But Stephanopoulos wasn't backing down, even as his guest was clearly preparing to flee. I brought you here to discuss your public statements and your advocacy work. The fact that discussing them with factual documentation feels like an attack might be something you need to examine. I don't have to subject myself to this kind of character assassination, Meghan declared, yanking the microphone pack from her belt. This isn't journalism. This is a hit job designed to tear down someone who's actually trying to make a difference in the world. The veteran journalist remained seated, his expression calm but resolute. Asking public figures to account for their statements and actions isn't character assassination, Duchess. It's accountability, something you claim to support when it applies to others. Meghan was already moving toward the exit, her security detail scrambling to keep up. She turned back one final time, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. You've shown your true colors tonight, George. This is why people don't trust the media anymore. This is why real advocates get silenced while people like you profit from tearing others down. The only thing I've shown tonight is documented evidence, Stephanopoulos called after her. Evidence that contradicts the public persona you've built your entire advocacy platform on. If that's uncomfortable, maybe the problem isn't with the journalism. But Meghan was already gone, storming out of the studio with her entourage trailing behind her, leaving Stephanopoulos alone at his desk with the damning documents still spread out in front of him. The cameras captured his expression, not triumphant, not satisfied, but simply resolute. He had done what journalists are supposed to do: hold powerful people accountable for their public statements, regardless of their status or the discomfort it might cause. When we return, he said calmly to the camera, we'll be discussing the importance of transparency in public advocacy and why documentation matters when evaluating the claims of public figures. The studio fell silent except for the hum of equipment, but the impact of what had just transpired was unmistakable. In less than an hour, one of the world's most carefully managed public figures had been systematically exposed, her credibility shattered, and her advocacy platform revealed as largely built on inflated claims and undisclosed financial arrangements. George Stephanopoulos had done what many thought impossible. He had gotten past the media training, the royal protection, and the carefully crafted image to reveal the uncomfortable truth underneath.